Very good afternoon. Welcome to ZEF. I'm Joachim von Braun, and I look forward to an interactive and interesting discussion with you and our International Advisory Board. Board members from all over the world. You will get to know some of them who will participate in this afternoon's debate about agendas. Agendas in the field of development goals, what goals in the future, agendas around land and water under climate change, and agendas under culture and development. The sessions will be shared by my two colleagues and myself. That is Manfred Denich and Konrad Schetter. May I ask, how about the acoustics in the back? Tanya, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Am I shouting too loud? No. Should I speak lower? I think this is the inauguration of our new audio systems. And you sit on new chairs. I was supposed to open up this meeting with news from ZEF. Those are two pieces of news. There are indications that ZEF is doing well, and let me say a few serious remarks about what's new in terms of content at ZEF. The research agenda which ZEF has been pursuing over the last 12 months has been enriched by a number of new significant research programs. The expansion of the program in West Africa on land use and climate change. A new research program on food security for the next 5 years. A research program that is rapidly expanding in the field of volatility of markets and their impacts on the poor. Further work expanding in the field of migration, and especially so new forms of migration in Central Asia and in the Asian region. Furthermore, new research in the field of health and sanitation. Last year we have set ourselves some goals in expanding in 3 areas. We wanted to do more on health, more on science policy, more on energy. We are gradually moving in all these fields, probably most slowly in the field of energy, but the commitment is there, and some, actually an additional energy economist is going to join us in November. So we are moving in these fields without diminishing our main focus on sustainability issues in relation to development. Colleagues, we have only 60 minutes each for each of these panels, so I want to start sharp at 2, if not earlier, with this panel. The first panel called Future of Development Agendas and Goals. Some of you may have looked into today's Financial Times, and it's an interesting op-ed article authored by the chair of RAC, the world's biggest NGO, Mr. Fazli Abed, and George Soros. By the way, ZEF cooperates with RAC in multiple ways. We have 2 large research programs with them. One on technology and how to get technology closer to the poor, funded by the Gates Foundation, and another one on drinking water and sanitation. So Mr. Abed and Mr. Soros have argued that we need very different goals for development in the future. And I happen to agree with them. They argue that we need, for instance, a goal on rule of law. 4 billion people live under circumstances which does not give them the protection of the law. Do we have rule of law currently on the development goal agenda? Yes, I think it's coming. It has come more from a rights-based approach to development, but that is right to development, right to sufficient food and so on. But it hasn't come yet enough from the side of rule of law, the protection of the law, the beneficiary, everyone equal before the law. The information age also requires that we pay attention to access for information by all. And we don't have this currently as a goal in development, but lots of people know that information is power. If you don't have it, you're lost. In the labor market, in getting access to the benefits of public services and so on. So, with these two development goal-related issues, rule of law, access to information, I wanted to challenge my dear panel to not just look at the current 7 MDGs and how they came about and should we extend them to the next 15 years, but to think beyond them. The panelists which we have here on this esteemed panel include the chair of our advisory board, Professor Hans van Ginkel, former rector of the United Nations University and rector of Utrecht University. Hans was Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and yes, good things have typically many fathers, usually one mother, but Hans can rightly claim that he was at the core of people who helped bring about the development goals of the who we currently have, the so-called MDGs. Mohamed Hassan is the former executive director of the Academy of Science for the Developing World and a science policy leader. He is based in Sudan, is very active in lead functions in the African Academies of Science. Matthias Kalkul is a senior researcher at ZEF, with a background in climate economics and energy. He is leading currently a research program on price volatility and the poor. Margarita Quiros comes from Colombia, and her doctoral research focuses on making farmers more productive, farmer field schools, the institutions which facilitate increased productivity. Villamor, originally from the Philippines, forestry environmental expert, was with the World Forestry Institute, senior fellow there, and will give us later an Asian perspective. I would like to ask that we start with you, Hans. Board members have 10 minutes, ZEF 5. Hans, please go ahead. Thank you again all for coming. Let's warmly applaud them before this.
Thank you very much, Joachim. It's good to be back in ZEF, although I come kind of regularly to see at least Joachim. In fact, you reminded me of what was for me the dilemma. I came as a rector from Utrecht. I became the rector of United Nations University. And I learned that the rector of United Nations University was an Under Secretary General of UN. So I asked the Secretary General, what does it mean to be an Under Secretary General of UN? In fact, that was an awkward question because they had never thought about it. And so I thought what it will mean is that my role is to make sure that the knowledge as it exists in universities and is being developed in universities is used as much as possible for developing the policies of the UN. So I was there, and in fact the Secretary General had a major problem combined two. One, there was going to be a Millennium Summit. So what to do? What to expect of a Millennium Summit? What could be achieved? It was quite clear that the different member countries of the UN would be prepared to do something extraordinary. But something extraordinary does not always mean that it really has to cost money. That's a different thing. And the other problem of the Secretary General was that during the 1990s, the amount of money available for development cooperation had almost halved. So how to reverse the trend? And maybe how to use the Millennium Summit to reverse this trend? That was the question. Walking around in New York, I was listening to the diplomats, what they thought that they were going to discuss in the Millennium Summit. And generally speaking, they had different modes of the same line. It was either eradication or alleviation of either hunger or poverty. You could fill in, and the compromise could go any direction, but within those four words. So I told them that I could expect, that I could accept, that diplomats and politicians would not be able to find a compromise going beyond this. But that I just happen to be from a university. And universities are not built for one-liners. Universities rather should go for understanding complexity. And we were at the other side of the globe in Tokyo, so we might start with complexity. And so maybe we should first look at what kind of problems there were on the table before trying to compromise. With the Office of the Secretary General, we did select about 28 topics that were on the table. Of course, that was a selection, but at least it was 28 and much more than the 4 elements I mentioned. And then these 28 were divided over 4 major groups: peace, governance and security, environment and development, each 7, to keep it manageable. And so we went out and we asked state-of-the-art papers of academics around the world for each of the 28 topics. They did deliver the state-of-the-art papers. And in January 2000 we had the Tokyo conference. For each state-of-the-art paper we asked 2 referees, which meant that we had working groups of 21 for each, 7 authors and 2 referees for each topic. And we asked them basically to look at the papers and the comments and then to boil it down to something manageable on these different topics, 4 major topics. Mrs. Fréchette, the Deputy Secretary General, came to Tokyo for the 2 days of the conference, and we had also half a day to try to bring all the conclusions of the 4 working groups together. All the material was sent to New York electronically. And so the Assistant Secretary General in the office of the Secretary General then made the Millennium Summit report, the Millennium Report of April 2000. Major topics were in 3 lines. Freedom from fear, which is peace and governance and security. Freedom from want, which is development. And sustaining the future, which is environment. And so all major recommendations are found their place somewhere in that report, and it was kind of incredibly translated into something like Millennium Goals. Of course, good ideas have many fathers and mothers, and there were inputs. The nice thing of this was that major institutions in the UN, like FAO and the World Health Organization, and also could all find their place. Something to think about, because otherwise they will start to compete. So you have to give them a place. They are in Millennium Development Goals, UNDP, UNICEF. And then Mohamed Hassan came in from the World Bank, became the head of UNDP, and he had learned you had to quantify. So the Millennium Development Goals have some kind of quantification. Later on, the major complaints about the Millennium Development Goals are that they do miss different things. No one is realizing, him or herself, that there are so much more than you could expect originally. So how much can you find at the global level to be part of the Millennium Development Goals? And can be subscribed? Personally, coming from the urban sector, I regret that I've never been forceful enough in the housing sector and urbanization. Many people oppose urbanization, whereas basically the problem is not the fact that people live urban, but the fact that there are so many people. So they look at the resources going through an urban entity being used. But no one explains that when distributed in a more different way in the rural areas, the same number of people would eat the same amount of food, or still would need a house. No? So often the number of resources are kind of independent from the way in which people are located. But the major mistake was that at the end there were 100 million slum dwellers less, whereas you could predict that in time, until 2050, there would be 1 billion people more in cities in developing countries. And they are not going to be in luxury neighborhoods. So the 100 million was far too little. So we made mistakes, and there should be more research. Of course, you should not look only at the summit, because then 2002 there was Johannesburg, and the environmental issues were taken up, the sustaining the future were further elaborated. There was, of course, 2003 also the World Water Forum in Kyoto, and many of the decisions taken on water and sanitation kind of pushed further there. In 2005 and 2006 we had the IT conferences in Geneva and in Tunisia. They were on open standards, open access. I rephrase it to information society open to all, because in Africa most information still comes by radio and not by computer. So different ways of looking at these things, but they are kind of all related, and you should do that, because all these conferences nowadays tend to be related. And I would just like to leave it there as a background. We have to look further. But when I look at the rule of law, yes, that it is part of the rephrasing of development, as development relates to the UN goals of peace and progress. And progress then was translated into development. And development then was gross national product. And that's where we were starting to argue against. And we have broadened the concept of development to include social and human development. And there you have to include the rule of law. And when you talk about access to information, it's all in fact there. It was in the summits on IT. But it has to be broadened, it needs more interest. But at the same time you have to realize yourself
that the countries will have difficulty to come to an agreement on the rule of law. When I came in Tokyo, I was continuously confronted with the remark that Asian values were different from the values that were behind human rights. I must tell you that often I asked them then, what were the Asian values, what made them specific? And when they became more specific, I said, well, that are exactly the same values we have in the rural areas in the east of my country. Because it's about the collectivity being important, all these things. So the differences may not be so big. But politically, people will try to take a position that it is incompatible with each other. So we have to look at research, what is important, and we have to realize ourselves, what can we, in fact, in cooperation between countries, accomplish. Thank you very much.
Hans, may I just ask one quick question? Where did the agenda freedom from fear get lost? Why was this not part of the MDGs? The freedom from fear agenda, which related to security.
I don't know. In fact, it was in the translation between the April report and the Millennium Development Goals where the countries could agree on in the December, what is it, November, December, in the autumn session at the UN in 2000, the Millennium Summit. And I really believe that it has to do with the fact that many countries think that there were many issues there they could not agree on globally. And that therefore they rather than, many of the issues are also less easily to be quantifiable. And there was a strong tendency only to have Millennium Development Goals that could be quantified.
But it was reassuring to hear the process and the involvement of expertise and research, the 21 topics and papers and peer review and so on. Many of us probably did not know that the MDG creation process involved this fundamental work. Mohamed,
but to be honest, much of it went down the drain when compromising on the 8 Millennium Development Goals, even though much is in the sub-goals still.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Joachim. I will just say a few comments about the 3 issues that relate to the role of science policy in the future development agenda. And the first issue I want to address is science for policy for future development goals. Hans spoke about the MDGs. MDGs, as you all know, targets for specific development goals, but failed completely to design a mechanism on how to achieve these goals. And that was discussed the Rio +20, and hopefully the Sustainable Development Goals will address this issue of how to get there by drawing maybe a roadmap for each Sustainable Development Goal. And it is here when we start to design a roadmap for achieving a specific global development goal that science and technology comes in big force. Because it's really extremely important that science and science policy, appropriately designed science policy, have a role in developing and implementing any mechanism to achieve the targets. And to be very specific, I'll give you an example. At the Rio +20 event, 2 very important interrelated issues or goals were identified and debated at length. One is poverty eradication, that was pushed by Brazil in particular. Brazil was very keen on that. And the second is the green economy. But we are very convinced that any progress on these 2 very much interrelated goals rest on sound science policy that relates especially to the development, the transfer, and the diffusion of green technologies. You cannot have green economy or green jobs without having green technologies. Green technologies are extremely important. And so many people understand green technologies in different ways, but again, I will be very specific. And I will mention three, what we regard in the scientific and technological community are grand challenges. One is affordable water purification and sanitation technologies. Second, affordable energy systems for rural communities, technologies. And the third, affordable new vaccines against malaria, TB, and HIV. So these are challenges for the scientific and technological communities, but we all know that if these challenges are addressed and solved through science and technology, they have direct implications to poverty, eradication, and also to green jobs. So that's the first issue. The second issue, I want to look at the role of frontier science and technology knowledge, global partnerships in science policy for future development goals. And we all know that new and cutting-edge science and technology have transformed business, economy, and industry globally. But we also know that these same technologies, if harnessed properly, can also look at problems related to poverty eradication and green technology. We know the information and communication technologies, how they transform the lives of villagers and poor communities. We know the role of green biotechnology, and even we know the role of green nanotechnology, which is now emerging as the most powerful technology that the world has ever faced so far. But the good news is that these technologies are now becoming extremely important for a majority of developing countries. But a few developing countries have really taken the lead and have become global powerhouses in these technologies. These countries are led by China, as you all know, Brazil, and India, and many others. China is now the second to the United States in production of frontier knowledge, second to the United States, and first in the whole world in the production of knowledge in the area of nanoscience and nanotechnology, and in the production of green technologies. This is really very important because if a country like China takes the lead in designing and developing green technologies and in exporting equipment related to green technologies, then that will really help the rest of the poor communities in the developing world. Because the problems that solve the poor communities in China or India can also be used to solve the problems of the poor in other parts of Africa and elsewhere. So this trend may very well continue and continue very, very strongly. And if that happens, there is a very convincing argument that maybe in 10 years, the developing world will lead the entire world in the design and the manufacturing and the transfer of green technologies that really relate to real-life problems in poor communities. And these are the good news. But of course, this is also opening a door for another model for development, which I call a triangular model. That is, you have a South-North-South collaboration. Now we know that South-South cooperation in technology transfer is becoming very, very strong, and in many cases even stronger than North-South collaboration. China is now the largest exporter of technology that relates to solar energy in the entire world, and especially to Africa. So we know that this trend is moving forward, but we also know that we should not fail to understand that North-South collaboration is also very important. So how about putting the two together and making a triangular type of collaboration? Let's say South, North, South. Specific examples, China, European Union, Africa. Can the three get together to design technologies that can help African communities? Something to think about anyway, maybe during this session. And the third issue, very quickly, relates to the global science advice for global leadership. Several scientific organizations and many of us in the scientific community try very hard to convince the Secretary General of the United Nations to appoint a science advisor. Because we feel as scientists, especially those working in academies of science, that it's very important that people like the Secretary General of the United Nations gets the right science advice on specific issues and gets impartial advice that's credible that is based on scientific evidence and nothing else. No politics, no bias in any sense. And finally, the Secretary General accepted that. He accepted to have a science advisor or an advisory panel. A committee was appointed by the Secretary General to look at how to address this issue. And the committee came up with a proposal to have an advisory panel and not a single science advisor. And that's really very good news, very good news. But UNESCO has been charged to nominate the candidates. Now, this is where I think big questions are asked. Two big questions, of course, are very important. First, the composition of the panel itself. If it is done that way, this panel is going to be, first of all, merit-based, multidisciplinary, no influence of governments or other organizations. And we heard that UNESCO insists that they want to be in the panel. So that's a big question. The second question, which is also very, very important, critical, is the credibility and impartiality of the advice itself. So it has to be independent. The people who give the advice have no interest themselves, except that they base their judgment on solid scientific facts. But if these two things are met by UNESCO, I think this is really a very good start for the United Nations as a whole to get proper science advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. Great points. Goals need instruments. Frontier knowledge changes the game of development, and it will come increasingly and maybe predominantly, we said, come from China and other emerging economies. And we need mechanism for global science advice, for global leadership. It would be interesting to imagine if you put yourself into this advisory panel, and it's ideally composed, what would they put at the top of their agenda of science advice?
Well, I think the future topic itself that we're discussing, the future development goals with our agenda, that's important in itself. What type of goals, what type of agendas to be addressed through science and technology, that's important.
Let's move on and ask Grace Villamor for her input, some perspective from Southeast Asia. You see, we play tricks with each other here. I can easily be stopped if Grace pushes her button, and then I'm out of voice. So panels following, please exercise it too, like we just do. Now you are.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to give the perspective of the Southeast Asia, or Asia particularly, because the UN is claiming that the majority of the success in Millennium Development Goal is in Asia and Pacific region has been the propelling people out of poverty. And in fact, the UNESCAP is giving figures from 1990 to 2009 that they reduced the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 from 50% to 20%. But in fact, there are some other development targets that are lagging. Like, for example, this climate change that is increasingly threatening the food security. And you know that Asia suffer most, like, for example, the increased number of climate change-related natural disasters, like, for example, the typhoons in the Philippines and Vietnam, this El Nino in Indonesia, at the same time the floods in Thailand. So the focus, their attention is focused on the national economic impacts as well as the threat to the individual, particularly to the women, the community, and their livelihoods. Now, in MDG, the missing key issue is the climate change. UNESCAP is claiming that there was an increase of forest cover in the region, but in fact it failed to reduce carbon emissions. For example, in Indonesia, where forests, the conversion of peat swamps, which is 4 times much higher of carbon dioxide, is not part of the agenda. And this is also related to Professor Van Ginkel's talking about the raising calls in Asia to bring cultural values to bear in tackling the most major challenges of our time, seeking sustainable lifestyle which is inspired by Asian traditions to build on local institutions and social solidarity. So some of the National Action Plan make specific reference to Confucian or Gandhian traditions. And for example, in the National Action Plan for Greenhouse Gases Reduction in Indonesia, they actually included the village forest where the community will be the one to identify and manage this village forest where there is a strong participation of women. Now, what are the implications to the development research? Well, the question is, what is the basis of these development targets? So most of the targets and the indicators are actually based on the weak and limited, insufficient data. So there is this discrepancy between the national and international data series, particularly on a given indicator, because of the time lags and as well as the necessary adjustments that is being made by the international agencies. Now, related to this is the forecasting using historical data. So one can argue that the world today looks considerably different from the world that this data has been taken or drawn. So related to the climate change, so any forecast based around business as usual trends will grossly inadequately provide meaningful targets. Now, when it comes to food security and climate variability, so agricultural adaptation is key. And it involves technological and innovations for climate smart agriculture, both in food deficient and agriculturally rich countries in response to their specific needs. So will this open up a new opportunities to broaden the momentum of social and political change, like what Professor Hassan is saying, the South-South or South-North cooperation? So in my conclusion, it is clear that no single generic approach will work everywhere. So every country has to address their own circumstances so that these global goals should not be interpreted as necessarily attainable at the country level for every country.
I'm sure we will come back to that. Next, Margarita, Quiros.
Hello, good afternoon. Today I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about MDGs from the Latin American perspective. So first of all, how is Latin America doing in reaching the Millennium Development Goals? Well, in general, the region is moving towards the achievement of the goals, especially in aspects such as undernourishment, provision of universal schooling, gender equality, access to clean water and sanitation, and maternal and child health. And it did not take big steps back due to the crisis in 2008. But in any case, poverty and extreme poverty are still largely unresolved issues in Latin America, so that's what I'm mostly going to address now. The region holds the record for income inequality, and MDG achievements have also been very unequal, especially between rural and urban areas. The accomplishments are especially lower when minorities such as indigenous groups or African American groups or women and children are observed. For the future, the task of reaching development goals then should be sensitive to distributional issues to make sure that those mostly deprived of meeting their basic needs are attended first. Also, despite the accomplishments in economic growth in Latin America, many people are still vulnerable to conflict-related or ordinary violence and insecurity, and that relates to what was talked about, the freedom from fear. The achievement of poverty and employment goals are set back, for example, by forced internal displacements, as is the case in Colombia, and state abandonment and disregard of basic human rights. The enforcement of institutions for the resolution of conflicts the effectiveness of judicial systems, the capacity of countries to deal with post-conflict scenarios, issues of victim reparation and discrimination can contribute to poverty reduction, but are missing from the current MDGs. Poor people are also the most vulnerable to natural disasters that result from climate change phenomena such as El Niño and La Niña. These events pose a threat on their livelihoods and add uncertainty to economic activities. Country preparedness for such catastrophic events is not included in the MDGs. However, according to the UN 2010 MDG report, China and Peru are good examples of strategic investment for the reduction of risk in the event of natural disasters, being more efficient in MDG attainment as fewer resources were spent on reparation after disasters occurred. Latin America is also a resource-rich region. Unfortunately, we have a combination of opportunities for sustainable development with corruption. The disclosure of information related to the use and management of land and natural resources, and how public resources are being used to protect natural resources, as how profits that are derived from these resources are being reinvested, should be demanded, and could possibly be measured through transparency, efficiency, or competence assessments. Lastly, and a bit related to this, illicit drugs and their traffic is another challenge in Latin America that should be given priority on a global scale. As long as there is demand, there will be supply, and the illegality of the business only makes it more profitable. Violence, greed, community loss of core values, institutional exposure to drug money, and destruction of the environment affects the attainment of MDGs in Latin America at least. So what are the implications of these reflections for research? I think future research should look into the institutions that are needed for fair conflict resolution. The institutional needs and opportunities of post-conflict development should be particularly researched. The structural causes of poverty have to be identified. For example, in Latin America, exclusion reinforces inequality, which in turn hampers poverty reduction efforts. Research relating to the reduction of vulnerability and risk, especially with a focus on women and minorities, could bring about improvements in efficient use of resources. Also, research about responsibilities and accountability in global development and natural resource use is also needed. Lastly, the potential of information and communication technologies to support all these aforementioned topics. The importance of platforms for improved access to information, the encouragement in the use of technologies, and participation have to be addressed through the future research into ICTs for development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Matthias.
Thanks. So I want to talk briefly about why do we need development goals, and why are development goals for me as researcher very important. The Millennium Development Goals can be criticized for many things, for being purely normative statements, non-binding targets without clear responsibilities and mechanisms, and for lacking concrete measures to quantify success of achieving these goals. But I think the most important aspect of goals is to establish awareness and consensus. A consensus of a joint vision on how to shape the living conditions of the entire humankind. And such a consensus is very helpful for me as researcher to prioritize research and to decide where to put my effort on, but also for politicians, experts, the civil society and scientists who are all from different countries and cultures. Most people want something like development, but they have different understandings, even here at our institute at ZEF. Some discern development if GDP increases, others if the participatory rights of people increases, and yet others see development if virgin forests are converted to productive arable land. The beauty of goals is that they can be universally defined and accepted without specifying the ways how to achieve them. Most would see this as a weakness, but actually it provides a useful arrangement of responsibilities. It's the entire society who decides what it wants, which is a very difficult question about ethical beliefs. But it's on the experts and informed subjects to find tailor-made solutions. which require a completely different kind of knowledge. There is, for example, not one single and clear policy for reducing hunger, because hunger is the consequence of a complex interplay of market failures, institutional failures, behavioral and ecological factors. However, once goals like the MDGs exist, we can engage in heated debates and discussions on the ways how to achieve them. We can discuss whether school feeding programs are a good way or the best way to increase schooling, but we do not need to discuss whether it's a good idea that all girls go to school. Thus, an explicit consensus on goals eases communication and focuses discussions on ways to achieve them. Making goals and their achievement measurable is further a very important exercise to improve the joint understanding of goals. This helps to discover whether targets are only a superficial consensus to a set of common words that are interpreted completely differently, like development example in the beginning, or the problem to define and measure hunger, which is far from being trivial. So thinking about measurements avoids such superficial consensus by being more explicit about what goals actually mean and how to find an objective way to achieve them. Measures are always prone to the critique to be undercomplex, as all the input variables again have to be measurable and we cannot measure everything. Another problem is that too much explicitness could make it difficult to reach a consensus. Although these concerns determine the practical limits of measures, I think we should try to make development goals more measure-oriented. So concluding, I think development goals should be goals, visionary goals, but not policies or concrete mechanisms. We should try to make development measurable, and this is where we as researchers can give useful thoughts and useful proposals, and where we can also build pressure to politicians to think about measurement and what to build a consensus on. And finally, development research should be about policies, technologies, institutions and mechanisms to reach these goals. And if I may add to this, I want to confirm this statement of Mohamed Hassan. I think it's important that the scientific community also finds a consensus on mechanisms. And there's one role model on this. This is the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change, which tries to find a consensus and to identify areas where there's no consensus. But this is all about mechanisms and not about targets. Thanks.
Great. If I heard between the lines of the last three statements correctly, I think there was some critique of goals, but goals as such were much appreciated. But the importance of countries finding their own destinies, the multiple ways to achieve goals were also underlined from Latin America, different values and different approaches in East Asia, and in principle in the last statement by Matthias. I would like to throw the discussion open now and ask for comments, questions, any contributions from you in the audience. And don't hesitate to make comments from yourself rather than addressing this panel. Don't feel constrained to be a panelist yourself. So I go all the way to the back. Saravan, please introduce yourself.
I'm Dr. Saravan and I'm a senior researcher at ZEF. Thank you very much for the panelists for a very nice overview of the issues of MDGs and its implementation on ground. Very nice that the MDGs really give a vision. It's a goodwill intention of the international agencies to promote or to alleviate poverty. That's fine. But how it is hijacked by the international agencies, let me give some examples on addressing water and sanitation. If you see the reports that went into the deliberations of water supply and sanitation, there is a clause called improved water supply and also improved sanitation. When they say improved, it's not very clear what do they mean by improved. There is the categories. One is the piped water, one is the hand pump and the tube wells, and then other things, duct wells, etc. comes. And if you see in the past 10 years how these programs have been implemented, most of it goes for hand pumps and tube wells. And you know, these kind of interventions really expose mass poisoning among the people. And this is not really taken into account from the experience of Indo-Gangetic Plain or from Africa. Let me say another example in terms of health. Health, they want to address maternal mortality, child mortality, etc., and so on. If you see the amount of money that goes into addressing these in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of it goes for clinical trials. Now, how do these international agencies hijack these goals for their own benefits? They come up with a short-sighted approach. DFID clearly mentions in the June report how they want to address water supply and sanitation. They say we don't want to take a long-term approach, we want to take a short-sighted approach of addressing MDGs, and we don't want to take water supply, sanitation, sewage nexus, but we want to focus on only providing technologies for in-house water supply systems. Now, this is also true for other funding exams, just citing examples from DFID. Now the point is, what is to the panelists and also for the ZEF researchers is how these MDGs are being hijacked by international agencies with short-sighted approach, with sometimes irresponsible. When I say irresponsible, they come up with a baggage. Baggage is either the companies or industrialists or some sort. You can see many of the institutions, international agencies comes with some of the companies who has to provide medicines for Africa, and most of the funds goes in channeling this money for medicines rather than in building capacity on health in sub-Saharan Africa. The second thing that comes to the issue of North-South, South-South and North-South-South collaboration, and it's very commendable that Paris, Accra, Busan Declaration has come out very nicely. Now, to what extent do these declarations try to address the short-sighted view of international development agencies, irresponsible attitude of the international development agency? The third and final question that comes to the ZEF researchers and to the panelists is, how do researchers try to address these kind of things, partly because ZEF works largely on international grants, and international agencies largely dictate what they want to do with little maneuverability from researchers. In fact, science is partly getting shaped by international funding issues. So this is something, a question to the ZEF as a team, as an institute also, and also to the board members. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'd like to take 2 or 3 more, and I see my colleagues taking notes. Margarita. Then I've seen here Paul. Go ahead.
Commendable comment and presentations, how to measure and how to look at the how things are realized, that on paper look measurable. But my main point is a different one. I like the presentations because rather than just re-contemplating the MDGs, some of you pointed out the sort of huge elephants standing in a dark room, which are not on the agenda at all. I liked, if I could pick as examples, these weren't the only ones, what Margarita said. Drugs. It's huge. It's a warfare. It's a $100 billion thing. It doesn't just have economic and social effects, but I would welcome if ZEF would look into the environmental impacts, the poisoning impacts of anti-drug campaigns in countries like Colombia, but not only. In the past decades, you have poisoned aquifers and so on and so forth. So if anybody wants to do critical environmental research as it relates to people and their health, this is the place. Another example in the same line is natural disasters. If you look at the statistics more published by the climate community, the incidence and the gravity of impact has increased immensely, even since the Millennium Goals were developed. It's not just droughts, it's too much water, it's too much irregularity. And I know there's research being done on this, but the more we can get, the better and the more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh.
Yes, I want to first of all thank all the speakers for the very nice presentations. There is one Millennium Development Goal that never appears on any of the agendas, and it's probably about time that we also at ZEF start taking a look at it. In the equation of how to sustain life on this globe, there are two parts of the equation. One side of that equation is population. And that part of the equation is never in any of the development goals. In fact, there is relatively little research done. Almost any presentation that is being brought to an international audience will start with the 3 or 4 projections of how population might or might not evolve. And then we move right on to our natural resources, climate change, disasters, and all the other topics. And for some reason, one side of the equation is not being addressed, neither very much in research, nor in any of the development goals that are eventually adopted by international agencies. And I think it's about time that we square that and take that into our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask my colleagues to take up one or the other, and then quickly have another round. Let's be brief. Hans, would you like to react to one or the other points?
Different ones. I think the researchers should be engaged in to look at the complexity of issues, and in particular the relations between different issues, because that is not done enough. In the political system, there is a certain segmentation of reality. And with the MDGs we have tried to at least find some, at least mitigation of this. Now just realize yourself, within the framework of those who agreed on the MDGs have been a relative success. Why? Because within 10 years development assistance was more than doubled. Now this money issue I told you was in the beginning a major problem, and it was focused in its use. And in fact, when you look at many of the topics in the MDGs, in the global patterns, there is major progress, in particular in Asia and Pacific. What is often not mentioned is that the figures for Asia and Pacific are biased because China is doing so well and there are living so many people in China. And so you can find at the national level all these differences. And so there is a certain level of over-gratifying kind of approach of the MDGs because they don't look well in the details. When I talk with people who are in the World Business Council or so and looking at it, they want to eradicate hunger. And they will just have all the type of activities that go into this area. When you look at the MDGs also, that's one of the reasons why freedom from fear was submitted, is that there was a very narrow approach at the end of the day between the countries on specific elements, less mothers dying than giving birth. No, less children dying in the first 5 years of their lives. And many of these issues are in themselves very important. When this can be achieved, one should not underestimate this, and it can be quantified. The quantification of these MDGs in general is not a problem. My problem is that most MDGs are in fact only the quantifiable ones. The other ones are almost there. Even not sustaining the future is a general qualitative. Now many of the issues then can be referred to other conferences. So when you talk about natural disasters, there was the Kobe conference, 2005. That was on natural disasters. People segment reality. the IT issues that were in Geneva, and so they will not be part of the MDGs. So the reality is that when countries come to some kind of agreement, they will look for a segmentation of reality in different parts. What academics should do is all the time focus on the relation between the different issues. And whether it's on the, for instance, the water example and the arsenic pollution, of course there are also issues where scientists can come in much more early, because the hand pump method was a very good method to supply drinking water. Only no one had looked at the lower layers in the soils where the arsenic was present and the arsenic contamination that come from. So we have to go for better, but all these things have to come up by our research, and we should do early research, not late when the problem is there.
Margarita, would you like to echo?
Thank you. Well, I'm very happy that this comment on the illicit drug business had an echo on the audience, because I really think it's a global issue. The environmental impact is very strong, but I think it's also a health issue that has to be looked at, and we shouldn't let this problem take advantage of us. It's like a mental health issue, we could look at it, and it's something that the countries can measure, because the demand is there, and the fight against drugs has been ineffective. So I think it's something that where global action is very welcome and should be looked into, and of course the environmental consequences are very, very hard.
Maybe one line here. In the UN system, everyone will look at Vienna. There is the drugs organization at the UN, and they will think they are responsible for that. It's the same way why in the Millennium Goals in 2000, and there was no presence of anything on climate really, because they said the Kyoto Protocol is in '97, so when it comes to emissions, countries have already committed themselves to this, and we cannot get a better agreement than Kyoto in 2000. The same population in Johannesburg 2002, Wolfgang Lutz and I and some others published in Nature a declaration on population, EASA based, and again now there was such a thing. But the population conference did fail completely before Johannesburg. And in Johannesburg there was nowhere to get population on the agenda. And that was very much on birth rights, it's mother's rights, on reproductivity and so on. And there is a major difference of opinion all around the world. So whatever we think there will be no agreement. That's the problem. That's why population is missing.
Colleagues on my left, further reactions. Don't hesitate to say something. We should enforce goals. We always look to the United Nations. Maybe the future goals get pushed upwards on the agenda through much more complex mechanisms of societal discourse.
Yeah, just a quick comment and a question. The comment relates to, I think somebody there mentioned South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation, and there was some confusion there, but let me just add one additional comment that I forgot to mention earlier. In the view of many of us, South-South cooperation or transfer of technology, whether North-South, South-South, can only succeed in a sustainable manner if it is accompanied by knowledge transfer. If you just transfer the technology and put it there, forget about it, then it won't last long. Some form of training, some form of capacity building has to take place at the same time you are transferring the technology. And this is the only assurance that the technology will be maintained and sustained in that particular location. So knowledge transfer should accompany the technology transfer. The second is just a question, and that relates to poverty. Lisa?
Okay.
Margarita. We read very recently about the great successful experience Brazil in lifting a large proportion of its population, about 40 million people, above the poverty line. And they used various methods of doing that. Now we talked about poverty in Latin America, but has this very successful experience of Brazil, and I think part of it giving money to poor families so that their children go to school, so that they go to school, get education, and then they can sustain their families. And I'm just asking whether this model has actually been replicated in any of the localities in Latin America.
Well, as far as I know, Oportunidades is that's the program in Mexico. Then that's the replication of how it's been, and also in Colombia there have been some cash transfers. They're like conditional cash transfers for school attendance. The problem I see is when they fall into the wrong hands. This kind of conditional cash transfers programs, but it's actually true. They have proven to have good results. It's just that they are sustainable in time, and they come with something else than just cash transfers. But they have had good results in Mexico, I believe.
We must not cut into the next panel's time. I've seen a few pens. These can be sound bites. One there, we don't need to respond to everyone, but you should have a voice. Aaron, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Aaron Zieri, Senior Researcher at ZEF. Thank you. I just had this very interesting experience. I was yesterday on a panel where there was basically a very, very different consensus, namely a consensus that the MDGs were not such a good thing after all. And this was the section on development theory and policy of the German political scientists had a session on the state-of-the-art of development theory, where Philipp de Pennies, formerly from the KfW, delivered a speech on the MDGs. And, I was actually wondering why these were serious points of criticism, which have been discussed in the community, have been hardly mentioned here. I would like to mention 3 points, which de Pennies also was referring to. And the first one is the methodological criticism, which is fairly obvious. It is not even clear whether the Millennium Development Goals were referring to a global scale or referring to a country performance, or in what way. It was neither clear in how far the measurement of poverty, the $1.25 purchasing power parity dollars, in how far this was a legitimate or scientific measurement. I'm referring here to Thomas Pogger and Sanjay Reddy, who actually wrote about this already many years ago. How not to count poor was their article. The second point of criticism I would like to mention that, of course, in development theory, well, the MDGs are seen as a step backward because of the quantification of the goals, which does not leave room for empowerment, for participation, but which focuses on these quantifiable targets, no matter how they are being reached. As a footnote, the only goal which actually involves commitment of the OECD countries, namely Goal 8, does not have quantified points. Last one I would like to mention, well, if we look at the successes in poverty alleviation in the past 15 years, we see successes, but we see that these successes are not primarily related to official development assistance. We see the successes in China, but we all know that that the relation to official development assistance is not that obvious. And then it becomes fairly clear what the success of the Millennium Development Goals was what Hans van Ginkel has mentioned. It has managed to reverse the decline of official development assistance and to nearly double the amount of ODA which has been flowing. But this is more or less something where one might argue, okay, this is the institutional self-interest of the development aid business, and not necessarily something which we should applaud. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry that we have to draw this to a close in a moment, but I would like to ask Matthias and Grace if you have any comments on what you heard, including the last statement. Go ahead.
Well, sometimes men can go first.
Regarding the question of responsibilities and how to locate the problems on which scale, I think this debate is very useful and should be included for further development goals to look. There are global problems like climate change, global environmental problems, where a joint effort is needed. There are national problems. I think schooling, for example, is the responsibility of the national government, but sometimes they need help from outside, knowledge or financial resources from outside. And there should be some discussion about burden sharing, who helps whom in achieving these goals. I think this is very important.
About the first two questions that you asked, I think I mentioned a little bit about the data that were used in targeting the MDG. In fact, they have a very limited number, data available that they use, and that's why there's this discrepancies. And then when you talk about why numbers, why quantification of measurement, not this participation in development, because mostly the policymakers want numbers, like how many targets do we need for a year or within the next 10 years, which is supposed to be in this kind of actors. So probably we need to somehow do some more of the information or communication with them.
One sentence.
In particular, the one on methodological at what level, I find a childish argument. The UN is an association of countries. So the target should be reached at the national level, if possible at the continental. But that is not a question, it's quite clear. When it comes to the theory, and you say, well, that should go more to empowerment, this type of thing, this leads to all kinds of development policies which no one can ever check whether they are really successful. It will be too slow, and it will be very difficult to get any support for this. And then it comes to the successes. I think development aid has been very important, in particular in countries where they did not achieve the goals, but made improvement. China could do it itself, but there are many countries benefiting from development aid.
Well, thank you so much. After all, there was some controversy in the room. That's why we're here. Did the goals matter? Did the Millennium Development Goals matter in the past 12 years? Answer is clearly yes. Have been taken seriously. Measurement has been taken seriously with all its pitfalls. How can I say that? Look what has been achieved. The easy things have been achieved first. So poverty reduction, lots of progress, hunger reduction, not much progress. Analysis at ZEF and by others have shown people close to the lines, to the cut-off points, have been facilitated to make it across the lines. That also applies, by the way, to the cash transfer programs in Latin America. So the goals have been taken seriously. Measurement has made things somewhat distorted at the margin. Because we find that the poorest of the poor have been left behind. Those who are far below the achieving the goal targets. Anyway, but I think we also heard from this panel fairly broad consensus that the game around goals will be different. It will be more science-based. It will be more driven by the developing world itself. It will be less driven by the traditional donor communities, much less. It will involve hemispheric relationships, south-north, south, and new goals will be set in the process in relation to rights, in relation to sustainability. I think we have learned something from this debate, and I look forward to the next panel, which will start after we have emptied this table. We stretch for 5 minutes, and the next panel panel staff. Thank you all.